In the spring of 1868, on a remote salt island in the Louisiana marshlands, a bankrupt former banker mixed crushed peppers, vinegar, and salt in a hollowed-out cologne bottle. He had lost everything. His bank had collapsed. The plantation he lived on had been ransacked twice, first by Union soldiers during the Civil War, then by floods that turned the fields to swamp. The world he had built his life around, the antebellum South, its economy, its social order, its certainties, had been destroyed so completely that even the physical landscape looked different. The man was 50 years old, penniless by any practical measure, living on his father-in-law's property on an island so isolated that the nearest town required a boat to reach. He had pepper plants. He had salt from the island's own mine. He had vinegar. He had time. He mixed them. He aged the mixture in small oak barrels. He strained it, bottled it, and corked each bottle with a small wooden stopper. He gave some to friends. He sent some to grocers in New Orleans. They wanted more. That cologne bottle became Tabasco sauce. That bankrupt banker became the founder of one of the most recognizable food brands in history. Today, Tabasco is sold in 195 countries, every country on earth except North Korea. It has been in continuous production for over 150 years, from the same island, using a process so close to the original that Edmund McIlhenny himself would recognize it. The McIlhenny family still owns 100% of the company. No outside investors, no public shareholders, no corporate overlords. A family business, built by a bankrupt man with a cologne bottle and some pepper plants. Still running, still privately owned, still on the same island more than a century and a half later. How does that happen? How does a man who has lost everything create something that lasts forever? And what does the story of Edmund McIlhenny and the company he built tell us about resilience, about branding, about the specific kind of stubbornness that turns catastrophe into a legacy? The answer begins not in Louisiana, but in Maryland, where a young man with ambitions considerably larger than hot sauce was building a career that seemed for a while to be going exactly as planned. Fort Sumter fell on April 13, 1861. Louisiana had already seceded from the Union in January of that year, and New Orleans, the most important city in the Confederacy by almost any commercial measure, was immediately transformed from a commercial hub into a war economy operating under the existential pressure of a conflict that its business class had, at least partly, helped to cause. Edmund McIlhenny was 45 years old when the war began. He was not a soldier. His age and his position made military service unlikely, but the war transformed his world with a thoroughness that military service could not have equaled. The banking system of the antebellum South was built on credit extended against the value of assets, primarily land and enslaved human beings, whose value was, in the most fundamental sense, a product of a specific social and legal order. When that order began to collapse, the financial system built on it collapsed with it. New Orleans fell to Union forces on April 25, 1862, just over a year into the war. Admiral David Farragut's fleet passed the Confederate fortifications at the mouth of the Mississippi River in a night battle that the defenders of the city had believed impossible, and New Orleans found itself under Union occupation while the war was still in its early stages. The occupation brought with it the full weight of military governance, the suspension of normal commercial activity, the confiscation of Confederate assets, the radical disruption of the credit relationships that had sustained the city's commercial economy. McIlhenny's banking business did not survive the occupation intact. The specific circumstances of the collapse are not fully documented, but the general pattern was consistent across New Orleans banking. The Confederate currency in which loans had been made became worthless. The collateral against which credit had been extended, land and enslaved people, lost its legal status and much of its commercial value, and the correspondent relationships with northern banks that had sustained normal commercial banking operations were severed by the war. The McIlhenny family fled New Orleans as the Union forces approached, retreating to Avery Island. The island, remote and difficult to access, seemed to offer a degree of protection from the disruptions of the war, a place where the family could wait out the conflict in relative safety, sustained by whatever the land could produce and whatever remained of the family's assets. The island did not offer the protection they had hoped for. In 1863, Union forces raided Avery Island specifically because of its salt mine. Salt was a critical military resource used to preserve food for armies in the field, and the Confederacy's salt supplies were a legitimate military target. The raid was destructive. The mining operation was disabled. The family was forced to flee again, this time deeper into Texas, where they spent the remaining years of the war as internal refugees, displaced from their home by the military conflict that had also destroyed the commercial world in which McIlhenny had built his career. They returned to Avery Island after the Confederate surrender in 1865. What they found was a landscape transformed by war and neglect. The plantation fields had been abandoned for years. The salt mine had been damaged. The buildings that remained were in various states of disrepair. The social and economic world of antebellum Louisiana, the plantation system, the enslaved labor force, the credit relationships that had made the whole thing function, was gone. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery. The Southern economy was in ruins, and Edmund McIlhenny, returning to Avery Island at the age of 50, had no bank, no savings worth mentioning, no commercial position, and no obvious path forward. He had, however, noticed something in the landscape of Avery Island that would prove, over time, to be worth considerably more than any of the things he had lost. Growing wild on the island, or perhaps cultivated in a small kitchen garden before the war, and now spreading freely in the absence of anyone to tend or contain them, were pepper plants, Capsicum frutescens, small, fiery red peppers of a variety that McIlhenny had apparently encountered before the war and found interesting enough to keep. Exactly where the peppers had come from is a matter of some dispute in the McIlhenny family history. Various accounts have attributed them to a Mexican soldier during the earlier conflict in Texas, to a traveler who passed through Louisiana before the war, to a New Orleans merchant with connections to Central America. The specific origin doesn't particularly matter. What matters is that the peppers were there, on Avery Island, when Edmund McIlhenny needed something to work with. He began to experiment. The story of how Edmund McIlhenny developed Tabasco sauce has been told many times, in many versions, with varying degrees of accuracy and considerable romantic embellishment. The core of the story is documented and consistent. Sometime in the period between 1865 and 1868, McIlhenny developed a recipe for a pepper sauce that he refined through experimentation, until he was satisfied with the result, and in 1868 he produced his first commercial batch, which he bottled in small cologne bottles, the only glass containers of appropriate size that were readily available on the island, and sent to New Orleans grocers and friends. The recipe was simple in its components and genuinely innovative in its process. McIlhenny crushed ripe red peppers, the Capsicum frutescens variety that grew on Avery Island, and mixed them with Avery Island salt. He placed the mixture in small white oak barrels, sealed them, and left them to age. After approximately 30 days, he added high-quality white wine vinegar to the aged pepper mash, stirred the mixture vigorously, allowed it to rest for another 30 days, then strained it through a cloth to remove the seeds and skins, retaining the liquid that had absorbed the heat, color, and flavor of the peppers. This aging process was not merely a practical expedient. It was, whether McIlhenny understood it in precisely these terms or not, a genuine fermentation process. The mixture of crushed peppers and salt creates an environment in which the natural bacteria present on the pepper skins produce lactic acid fermentation, breaking down the pepper flesh, developing complex flavor compounds, and preserving the mixture through the acidity that the fermentation generates. The result is a sauce that is more complex in flavor than any non-fermented pepper sauce, a layered combination of heat, acidity, and the fermentation-derived flavors that give aged hot sauces their depth. The addition of vinegar after the aging process served multiple purposes. It further acidified the sauce, extending its shelf life significantly. It diluted the pepper mash to a pourable consistency, and it added a brightness and sharpness that balanced the deeper, earthier flavors of the fermented pepper base. The specific quality of the vinegar mattered. McIlhenny was particular about this, specifying white wine vinegar rather than the cheaper distilled vinegar that most commercial condiment makers of the era would have used, and this choice contributed to the sauce's flavor profile in ways that distinguished it from its eventual competitors. The cologne bottles were a practical solution to a logistical problem. They were small, they were glass, they were sealed effectively with cork stoppers, and they were available. But the choice of a small bottle proved, in retrospect, to be one of the most important accidental decisions in the history of food marketing. A small bottle signals that the contents are to be used sparingly, as a flavor accent rather than a sauce to be poured liberally. It positions the product as an ingredient in a cook's toolkit rather than a condiment to be applied in large quantities. It creates a usage pattern, a few drops, carefully applied, that both extends the life of each bottle and reinforces the perception of the sauce as powerful, concentrated, and therefore valuable. McIlhenny initially produced 350 bottles in 1868. He sent them to grocers in New Orleans and to friends and acquaintances across the region. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The grocers reported that customers were asking for more. The friends were writing to request additional bottles. The product was, in the specific language of commerce, a hit, a genuine market response that went beyond polite appreciation into the territory of actual demand. In 1869, McIlhenny applied for a patent, technically a patent on the production process, not on the recipe itself, since recipes are not patentable. The patent application was granted in 1870. In the same year, he trademarked the name Tabasco, a word that is believed to derive from a Mexican state or indigenous language, though the specific etymology is disputed, and McIlhenny himself never provided a definitive explanation of where he encountered the name or why he chose it for his sauce. By 1870, McIlhenny was producing and selling Tabasco sauce commercially at a price of $1 per bottle, a price that was, by the standards of the era, genuinely premium. In the immediate post-Civil War South, $1 was a significant sum. McIlhenny was not selling a cheap condiment. He was selling a luxury product, positioned by its price, its distinctive bottle, and its small quantity usage pattern as something special, something worth paying more for, because it delivered an experience that cheaper alternatives could not replicate. This positioning was not accidental. McIlhenny was a banker. He understood pricing, perceived value, and the relationship between price point and market positioning in ways that most people who simply made food products did not. He knew that a $1 bottle of hot sauce was, in 1870, a statement, a signal to the buyer that what they were purchasing was not ordinary, not cheap, not the kind of thing you used without thinking. He was, from the beginning, building a premium brand. The question was whether the premium positioning would hold as the product scaled, and scaling was exactly what was about to happen. Edmund McIlhenny was not a man who thought small. The bankrupt banker who had watched his commercial world collapse had not retreated into the modest ambitions of someone who expected little from the future. He had rebuilt his confidence along with his pepper crop, and by the early 1870s he was thinking about Tabasco not as a local specialty or a pleasant sideline, but as a national product, something that could be sold across the United States and, eventually, beyond. The first challenge was production capacity. The initial batches of Tabasco were produced on Avery Island, using the family's own labor and the island's own resources. The pepper plants that grew on the island, the salt from the mine, the barrels that McIlhenny sourced as best he could from the limited commercial options available in the post-war South. Scaling this production without compromising the quality that had generated the initial demand was not a trivial problem. McIlhenny's solution was to expand the pepper cultivation on Avery Island systematically, selecting seeds from the best-performing plants of each harvest for the following year's planting, developing what would eventually become a seed selection and quality control process that was genuinely sophisticated by the standards of the era. He understood, as a practical matter, that the consistency of the final sauce depended on the consistency of the raw material, that if the peppers varied significantly in heat, ripeness, or flavor from batch to batch, the sauce would vary too, and the consistency that premium brand positioning required would be impossible to maintain. The small wooden implement that became one of the most distinctive aspects of the Tabasco production process emerged from this concern with quality. McIlhenny developed, or adopted from existing agricultural practice, a small red stick precisely calibrated to the correct degree of redness that indicated a pepper was ripe enough for harvest. Pickers on Avery Island were instructed to harvest only peppers that matched the color of the stick exactly, no lighter, no darker. Peppers that were too green would lack the full development of heat and flavor compounds. Peppers that were overripe would be mushy, difficult to process, and potentially contaminated by mold or rot. The Petit Bâton Rouge, the little red stick, became over time one of the most enduring symbols of the Tabasco quality control process, and it is still used on Avery Island today. It is a remarkably elegant solution to a practical problem, a low-technology, non-quantitative, universally applicable standard that requires no specialized knowledge to apply and no equipment to implement. Any worker in the field could use it correctly after a brief demonstration, and it ensured, across the variability of individual workers, individual seasons, and individual plants, that the raw material entering the production process met a consistent standard. The distribution challenge was addressed through the appointment of agents. McIlhenny could not personally sell Tabasco across the country. He was managing the production operation on Avery Island, developing the agricultural systems, and handling the administrative demands of a growing business. He needed representatives in major markets who would carry the product to wholesalers and retailers, take orders, and remit payment. He appointed a network of these agents across the United States, paying them on commission and providing them with the product and the promotional materials, primarily at this stage simply the distinctive bottle itself, that constituted the brand's commercial identity. The New York market proved particularly receptive. The city's population of recent immigrants from Southern Europe, Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, had culinary traditions that incorporated hot flavors in ways that the more northern European palate of much of the American population did not. The restaurant trade in New York, which was beginning to develop into the sophisticated industry it would eventually become, found Tabasco a useful ingredient for the kinds of dishes that the city's cosmopolitan population was beginning to demand. McIlhenny also pursued the international market with a directness that was unusual for an American food producer of the era. He sent samples to Britain, where the sauce found immediate favor among the population that had spent time in India and had developed a taste for the complex, spiced flavors of Indian cuisine. The connection between Tabasco and the Anglo-Indian dining tradition, Worcestershire sauce, curry powder, the general enthusiasm for pungent condiments that characterized the Victorian table of anyone with imperial connections, proved durable. Britain became one of Tabasco's most important early export markets and remains one of its largest today. By the mid-1870s, Tabasco was being sold across the United States and exported to Britain, with growing sales in Canada, continental Europe, and various other markets that McIlhenny's agents had reached. The brand was not yet the global institution it would become, but the pattern was established: the distinctive bottle, the premium pricing, the consistent quality, the international ambition that would define it for the following century and a half. Edmund McIlhenny was, by the mid-1870s, no longer a bankrupt former banker. He was a businessman with a going concern, a growing revenue stream, and a product that was beginning to develop the kind of market recognition that premium brands acquire when their quality is consistently delivered over time. He was not yet wealthy. The scaling of production and distribution required continuous reinvestment, and the margins on a product sold in small quantities at a premium price, while good, were not immediately transformative. But the foundation was solid in a way that his banking career had not ultimately been. A bank's assets are claims on other people's ability and willingness to repay. A hot sauce's assets are a recipe, a process, a brand, and a pepper plant. The recipe and the process could not default. The brand grew stronger with every year. To understand Tabasco fully, not just as a commercial product, but as the specific thing that Edmund McIlhenny built, you have to understand Avery Island itself, because the island is not merely the location where the sauce is made. It is, in a very real sense, a fundamental ingredient in what the sauce is. Avery Island is a salt dome, a geological formation created when a massive underground deposit of rock salt formed millions of years ago when the Gulf of Mexico periodically evaporated, was pushed upward through the overlying sediments by the pressure of the earth above it. The result is a raised island of approximately 2,500 acres, rising as much as 162 feet above the surrounding coastal marshes, a significant elevation in a landscape that is otherwise barely above sea level. The salt dome creates a soil chemistry that is genuinely distinctive. The salt leaches upward through the rock into the overlying soil, creating mineral conditions that differ from the surrounding marshland in ways that affect the growth of plants cultivated on the island. Whether this specific soil chemistry directly affects the flavor of the peppers grown on Avery Island, as the McIlhenny family has consistently maintained, is a question that the scientific literature has not definitively resolved. What is clear is that the peppers grown on Avery Island, selected and bred over 150 years of careful seed selection from plants adapted to the specific conditions of that soil, have characteristics that distinguish them from peppers grown elsewhere. The salt mine on Avery Island was, in Edmund McIlhenny's time, one of the most productive salt mines in North America, a genuinely significant commercial asset that predated Tabasco and would, in the decades following McIlhenny's death, become a major industrial operation in its own right. The mine provided the salt for the original Tabasco recipe, and the use of Avery Island salt in the early production of the sauce was both a practical convenience and a genuine quality decision. The specific mineral composition of the island salt contributed to the character of the fermented pepper mash in ways that McIlhenny observed empirically, even if he could not have explained the chemistry. The production process that McIlhenny developed has been refined and scaled over 150 years, but has remained, in its essential steps, remarkably close to what he originally established. Peppers are harvested by hand when they match the color of the Petite Baton Rouge. They are mashed with salt and placed in white oak barrels for fermentation. The aging period that in the early years was 30 days, but that in the modern production process extends to 3 years, a change that deepens the complexity of the fermented base significantly. After aging, the mash is blended with high-quality distilled vinegar, stirred for approximately 4 weeks, then strained and bottled. The 3-year aging process is perhaps the most significant departure from McIlhenny's original 30-day process, and it is worth understanding what that additional time does to the product. In the fermentation of the pepper mash, the lactic acid bacteria present on the pepper skins consume the sugars in the pepper flesh, producing lactic acid as a byproduct. Over time, as the fermentation progresses, the bacterial population changes. Different species succeed at different stages of fermentation, each contributing different metabolic byproducts that add to the complexity of the flavor. After 3 years, the fermented mash has developed a depth of flavor that a 30-day fermentation cannot produce. The modern McIlhenny company ages its mash in barrels that were previously used for the aging of bourbon whiskey, a choice that contributes additional flavor complexity from the residual bourbon and the toasted wood of the barrel interior. This is a refinement that McIlhenny himself did not implement, but that is entirely consistent with the logic of his original process, using whatever the available materials can contribute to make the final product better. The Jungle Gardens of Avery Island, a botanical garden and bird sanctuary established by Edward Avery McIlhenny, Edmund's son, in the early 20th century, are not directly related to the production of Tabasco, but are an important part of understanding what the McIlhenny family built on the island. The gardens cover approximately 170 acres and contain specimens of plants from around the world, along with a wildlife sanctuary that includes one of the largest populations of snowy egrets in North America. Edward McIlhenny was instrumental in saving the snowy egret from near extinction during the period when its feathers were in high demand for women's fashion. He raised a small population of birds on the island and released them into the wild, an early and successful example of wildlife conservation. The gardens and the conservation work are not incidental to the Tabasco story. They reflect a specific way of thinking about Avery Island, not as a production facility to be exploited for maximum immediate output, but as a place with intrinsic value that deserved stewardship. The McIlhenny family has maintained this perspective across multiple generations, investing in the island's ecology and natural beauty in ways that go well beyond what commercial calculation would require. The result is that Avery Island today is both a functioning industrial facility and one of the more remarkable natural environments in Louisiana, an unusual combination that is entirely consistent with the character of the institution that Edmund McIlhenny built there. The island is, in this sense, both the source of the product and the product's most fundamental marketing asset. When the McIlhenny Company talks about Avery Island, as it does consistently in every piece of marketing communication, in every tour that it offers visitors, in every account of the company's history, it is making a claim that no competitor can make, that there is a specific, physical, irreplaceable place from which this source comes, and that the place matters to what the source is. This geographical specificity is the anchor of the brand's authenticity, and authenticity is the attribute that premium food brands most need and most struggle to establish. Edmund McIlhenny died on November 21st, 1890. He was 75 years old and had spent the last 22 years of his life building the company that bore his product's name from a few hundred cologne bottles into a business that was shipping hundreds of thousands of bottles annually to markets across the United States and internationally. He left behind a company that was genuinely established, with production systems, distribution relationships, brand recognition, and a market position that no competitor had yet seriously challenged. He also left behind a family question that every successful founder eventually faces, who inherits not just the ownership, but the capability to continue building what has been built. The answer, in the McIlhenny case, was his son John Avery McIlhenny, who took over management of the company after Edmund's death and ran it through the 1890s. John Avery was capable and maintained the essential practices that his father had established, but his tenure is not the most dramatic chapter of the McIlhenny family business history. The dramatic chapter belonged to his younger brother, Edward Avery McIlhenny, who would take control of the company in the early 20th century and transform it from a successful regional specialty into a genuinely global brand. Edward Avery McIlhenny, known as Ned, was born in 1872, 4 years after the first commercial batch of Tabasco was produced, and grew up on Avery Island with the company as a constant presence in his family's life. He was educated at the University of Pennsylvania and subsequently developed a remarkably diverse set of interests and capabilities that went well beyond the management of a hot sauce company. He was a naturalist, an explorer, and a conservationist, the man responsible for the jungle gardens and the snowy egret conservation program that saved a species from extinction. He was also, when he turned his attention to the business, an exceptionally capable marketer with an intuitive understanding of what the emerging consumer economy of the early 20th century required from a premium food brand. Ned McIlhenny took control of the company in 1898, following his brother John Avery's decision to leave for other pursuits, and ran it until his death in 1949, a 51-year tenure that encompassed 2 world wars, the Great Depression, Prohibition, and the transformation of American food culture from the relatively local and regional patterns of the 19th century into the national consumer market of the 20th. His first major contribution was to the production process. Ned recognized that the 30-day aging period that his father had used was not producing the most complex possible flavor from the fermented pepper mash, and he began experimenting with longer aging times. The result was the transition to what would eventually become the 3-year aging process that the modern McIlhenny company uses. This was not a trivial change. Extending the aging time required significantly more capital, more storage capacity, and more patience than the original process, since barrels of fermenting pepper mash represent money tied up for 3 years rather than 1 month. The decision to make this investment reflected a confidence in the product and the business that only someone with a genuinely long time horizon could sustain. Ned also expanded the geographical scope of pepper cultivation, establishing growing operations in Central America, specifically in Honduras, to supplement the Avery Island production and provide the volume needed to supply the growing demand for the sauce. The Central American operations used seeds from the Avery Island plants, maintaining the genetic continuity of the pepper variety while expanding the production capacity beyond what the island alone could support. The international market expansion that Edmund McIlhenny had begun in Britain was accelerated significantly under Ned's leadership. He cultivated relationships with importers across Europe, South America, and Asia, developing distribution networks that were, for a small family company in the early 20th century, genuinely global in their reach. By the time of the First World War, Tabasco was being used by military kitchens across the Allied forces, an exposure that introduced the sauce to millions of soldiers who had never encountered it before and who carried the taste for it back to their home countries when the war ended. The First World War was, paradoxically, one of the best marketing events in Tabasco's history. Military kitchens dealing with the challenge of making nutritionally adequate but often unpalatable food acceptable to soldiers who were eating under stress, in cold and wet conditions, with limited variety and often compromised quality, discovered that hot sauce transformed the experience of eating in ways that other condiments did not. The heat stimulated appetite, masked off flavors, and provided a kind of sensory intensity that was genuinely welcome in the grim circumstances of military feeding. The soldiers who developed a taste for Tabasco in the trenches of France became customers when they returned home. People who had learned to want the specific experience that Tabasco provided and who sought it out in civilian life. This pattern, exposure through military service creating civilian demand, would repeat in the Second World War and would prove to be one of the most effective marketing mechanisms in the brand's history, entirely unplanned and essentially free. One of the most unusual aspects of the McIlhenny Company's history is not the product itself or the production process or the marketing. It is the fact that the company has remained entirely in private family ownership for over 150 years. Through circumstances that would have forced most businesses to seek outside capital, take on institutional investors, or sell to a larger corporation. Family businesses are common at the founding generation. By the third generation, the combination of estate taxes, diverging family interests, capital requirements for growth, and the inevitable dilution of the specific capabilities that built the business in the first place typically produces either a sale, a public offering, or a slow decline into irrelevance. Family businesses that remain privately owned and family-controlled across 5 or 6 generations are genuinely rare. Rare enough that the McIlhenny Company's longevity as a family institution is itself one of the most significant things about it. The secret, to the extent that there is one, appears to be a combination of structural decisions, cultural norms, and institutional arrangements that the McIlhenny family has maintained consistently across generations. None of these individually is complicated or unusual. Together, they constitute a system for preserving family ownership that has proven more durable than almost any comparable arrangement in American business history. The first element is the avoidance of outside capital. From Edmund McIlhenny's initial investment of his own limited resources in 1868 to the present day, the McIlhenny Company has financed its growth from its own operating cash flows rather than from external investors. This has meant, in practice, that the company has grown more slowly than it might have, with access to outside capital, that opportunities for more aggressive expansion or acquisitions have been foregone in favor of the slower but more controllable path of self-financing. The discipline required to make this choice consistently, across multiple generations and across periods of significant business opportunity where outside capital would have accelerated growth, is not trivial. Every generation of McIlhenny family members has faced the temptation, or the pressure from within the family, to sell a stake, to bring in a partner, to access capital that would allow faster growth. Every generation has, so far, declined. The reasons given vary: a commitment to independence, a desire to maintain control of quality, a family culture that values ownership over growth, but the practical effect is consistent. The company remains entirely in family hands. The second element is the management of family complexity. As a family grows across generations, the number of family members with claims on the business's ownership grows exponentially. A founder with 3 children produces 3 heirs. Those heirs produce 9 grandchildren. The grandchildren produce 27 great-grandchildren. By the 5th or 6th generation, the ownership of a family business may be spread among dozens or even hundreds of individuals, with varying degrees of connection to the business, varying levels of financial need, and varying views about what should be done with the asset. The McIlhenny Company has managed this complexity through a combination of family governance arrangements that have evolved over time, but that have consistently maintained the principle of unified management, even as the ownership has dispersed across an expanding family. The specific mechanisms have included family councils, shareholder agreements, restrictions on the sale of shares outside the family, and arrangements for the professional management of the business by family members who demonstrate the capability and commitment required. Rather than simply rotating the top management role through family members regardless of their qualifications, the third element is the product itself. Tabasco has qualities that make it an unusually good foundation for a multi-generational family business. It is not subject to fashion or technological disruption in the way that most products are. Hot sauce as a flavor category has been growing in popularity rather than declining, and Tabasco's position as the original and most recognized premium hot sauce gives it a durable, competitive position that is not easily threatened. The production process requires patient aging rather than continuous innovation. The 3-year fermentation that is central to the product's quality is in itself a structural commitment to the long-time horizon that family ownership facilitates. The brand is also deeply connected to a specific place, Avery Island, in a way that competitors cannot replicate. The geographical specificity of Tabasco's identity is a genuine competitive moat. You can make a hot sauce from capsicum, fruit essence, peppers, and vinegar and salt anywhere in the world, but you cannot make Tabasco from anywhere except Avery Island, because Tabasco is defined not just by its recipe, but by its provenance. This place-based brand identity is enormously durable. It becomes more rather than less valuable over time, as the history of continuous production on the same island accumulates, and as the authenticity that a century and a half of uninterrupted family stewardship represents becomes increasingly rare in a food industry dominated by corporate brands. The fourth element, and perhaps the most important, is luck, though luck of a specific kind that is not entirely separable from the choices that created the conditions for it. The McIlhenny Company has been fortunate that each generation has produced individuals capable of managing the business effectively, that none of the major crises it has faced have been existential, and that the product itself has remained relevant and in demand across radical changes in American food culture. This luck is not entirely random. The decisions that each generation made to invest in quality, to maintain the production process, to build the brand authentically, to keep the ownership in the family, created the conditions for the good fortune that followed. Companies that make these kinds of long-term, quality-focused decisions tend to be luckier than companies that don't. Not because fate rewards virtue, but because good decisions compound over time in ways that create resilience against the inevitable challenges that every business faces. For the first several decades of its existence, Tabasco had no serious competition. The market for premium bottled hot sauce in the United States was effectively a market of one. There were other condiments, other spicy preparations, other ways to add heat to food, but nothing that occupied quite the same position as Tabasco, a fermented, aged, genuinely premium hot sauce in a distinctive small bottle with a recognizable label, sold at a price that signaled quality. This comfortable monopoly did not survive the 20th century. As the American food market grew and diversified, as immigration from Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia introduced new culinary traditions and new flavor preferences into the American mainstream, the market for hot sauce grew dramatically, and the growing market attracted competitors who saw an opportunity that Tabasco's dominance had not fully addressed. The first major challenge came from Louisiana-style hot sauces, products like Crystal Hot Sauce and Louisiana Hot Sauce that offered a different style of hot sauce from Tabasco, less fermented, less complex, less expensive, and sold in larger bottles with a thinner consistency that was designed to be applied more liberally than the concentrated Tabasco. These products competed not directly with Tabasco's premium positioning, but with the broader category of hot sauce, expanding the market while offering consumers an alternative to the McIlhenny product for everyday use. The more significant competitive threat came in the 1980s and 1990s from a product that had been produced since 1928, but that became in those decades a genuine cultural phenomenon: Cholula hot sauce from Mexico. Chola offered a Mexican-style hot sauce that was more complex than the Louisiana-style products and that appealed to the growing American interest in Mexican cuisine and flavors. Its distinctive wooden-topped bottle made it a recognizable presence on restaurant tables across the country, and it competed directly with Tabasco for the attention of the consumers who were willing to pay more for a hot sauce they actually preferred. But the competitive landscape was transformed most dramatically by a product introduced in 1980 by a small company in California, Hui Fong Foods Sriracha, identified by its distinctive rooster label and its red cap. Sriracha offered a completely different flavor profile from Tabasco: sweeter, garlicky, thicker, without the fermented complexity of the McIlhenny product, and it became, in the 2000s and 2010s, one of the defining food trends in American culture. Its growth was organic and word-of-mouth driven, powered by the internet communities that celebrated it obsessively, and by the restaurant chefs who incorporated it into dishes that then exposed millions of diners to the product. The rise of Sriracha, Cholula, and dozens of other specialty hot sauces did not destroy Tabasco's market position. The brand remained the best-selling premium hot sauce in the United States throughout this period and maintained its global leadership position. But it did something more interesting than simple competitive displacement. It expanded the hot sauce category so dramatically that even Tabasco's relatively stable share of a much larger market represented significantly more volume and revenue than its commanding share of a smaller market had. The McIlhenny Company's response to the competitive intensification was characteristic of the institution that Edmund McIlhenny had built. It maintained the quality and the process of the core product while expanding the range in ways that addressed new consumer preferences without compromising the original. The company introduced a range of Tabasco variety sauces: Tabasco green sauce, Tabasco chipotle, Tabasco habanero, Tabasco sweet and spicy, that addressed different flavor preferences and different culinary applications while maintaining the Tabasco name and the quality standards associated with it. This line extension strategy is a double-edged approach for any premium brand. The risk is always that the extension dilutes the core brand's identity, that consumers who valued the original product for its specificity feel that the brand has been cheapened or spread too thin. The McIlhenny Company managed this risk by maintaining the original Tabasco as the flagship product, by investing in extensions only where the McIlhenny production capabilities could genuinely deliver quality rather than simply slapping the name on an inferior product, and by communicating clearly that the extensions were additions to the family rather than replacements for the original. The licensing of the Tabasco name for food products produced by other manufacturers, Tabasco-flavored potato chips, Tabasco-flavored almonds, Tabasco seasoned foods of various kinds, has been a significant revenue stream and a brand-building mechanism that extends the reach of the name into contexts where the sauce itself would not be present. The licensing strategy requires careful management. A licensed product that disappoints consumers will reflect on the brand, not just on the licensee. And the McIlhenny Company has been relatively selective about the license agreements it enters into, focusing on products where the Tabasco flavor can genuinely be delivered at a quality level consistent with the brand. The military continues to be one of Tabasco's most reliable markets. The McIlhenny Company has supplied Tabasco to American military rations, the meals ready to eat, or MREs, that are the standard field ration of the United States Armed Forces, for decades. The tiny bottles of Tabasco included in MRE packages are, by the accounts of veterans, among the most valued items in the ration, something that makes the otherwise often unpalatable meals of military field service at least interesting. The MRE connection is both a revenue stream and a brand-building mechanism that introduces the product to millions of people who then carry the habit into civilian life. The company has navigated the competitive challenges of the late 20th and early 21st centuries without losing the essential character of what Edmund McIlhenny built. The product is still made on Avery Island. The peppers are still harvested to match the color of the Petit Baton Rouge. The mash is still aged in white oak barrels. The family still owns 100% of the company. This consistency is not complacency. It is the result of a specific philosophy about what the company is and what it exists to do. A philosophy that has been transmitted with varying degrees of conscious articulation from Edmund McIlhenny through 6 generations of his descendants. Edmund McIlhenny died in 1890, having rebuilt his life and his fortune from complete destruction. The man who had arrived on Avery Island after the Civil War with nothing but pepper plants and determination left behind a company that was generating real revenue, selling internationally, and positioned to grow. What he could not have known, what no founder can ever fully know, was what the institution he had built would become across the generations that followed him. He could not have known that his grandson's grandson would still be managing the company on the same island, using a process recognizably descended from his original recipe, selling to consumers in countries that did not yet exist when he bottled his first batch. He could not have known that the cologne bottle he used to package his initial production would become one of the most recognized food packaging designs in history, displayed in museums, collected by enthusiasts, and imitated by competitors who understood that the form itself was part of what Tabasco communicated. He could not have known that the brand he built would outlast the Civil War he lived through, the First and Second World Wars that his descendants navigated, the Great Depression, the social transformations of the 20th century, and the disruptions of the Internet age, outlasting all of them not because it was immune to their effects, but because the foundation he laid was solid enough, and the family he left behind capable enough to adapt without losing the essential identity of what he had created. The Tabasco story is, at its most fundamental level, a story about the relationship between catastrophe and creativity. Edmund McIlhenny did not create Tabasco because he was a visionary food entrepreneur who identified a market opportunity and executed a brilliant business plan. He created it because he had lost everything, had very few options, had some pepper plants growing on an island, and was the kind of person who responds to constraint not with paralysis, but with invention. This is a specific and important kind of creativity, not the creativity of abundance, not the innovation that happens when resources are plentiful and options are wide open, but the creativity of necessity, the kind that emerges when the normal options are unavailable, and the question is simply what can be done with what is at hand. Edmund McIlhenny had peppers, salt, vinegar, oak barrels, time, and the commercial intelligence of a lifetime in banking. He used all of it. The banking background is worth pausing on, because it is easy to treat it as simply the career that preceded Tabasco, rather than as a contributing factor in what Tabasco became. But McIlhenny's years in banking gave him specific capabilities that were directly relevant to building a successful consumer brand. He understood pricing, the relationship between price, perceived value, and market positioning that determined whether a product was perceived as premium or ordinary. He understood distribution, how goods moved from producers to consumers through the network of intermediaries that constituted the commercial system. He understood credit, the patience to invest now and wait for returns later that is essential to any business that ages its product for months or years before selling it. He also understood branding in an intuitive sense that predated the vocabulary of modern marketing. The cologne bottle, the premium price, the distinctive label, the focus on consistency, all of these were choices that reflected an understanding of how products established themselves in consumers' minds as worth paying more for. McIlhenny did not study marketing. He had spent his entire adult life in a commercial environment where the difference between a trusted institution and an untrustworthy one was the difference between success and failure, and he applied that understanding to the product he built. The McIlhenny Company today employs approximately 200 people on Avery Island and in its administrative operations. It produces tens of millions of bottles of Tabasco annually, a number that would have been incomprehensible to Edmund McIlhenny in 1868 when 350 bottles constituted the entire first commercial run. The revenue figures are not publicly disclosed since the company is privately held, but industry estimates place annual revenues in the range of $200 to $500 million, a range that reflects the genuine uncertainty of trying to assess a privately held company's financials from outside. The company is now managed by the sixth generation of the McIlhenny family. Harold Osborne, a great-great-great-grandson of Edmund McIlhenny, currently serves as CEO, a title that might have puzzled Edmund, who did not think of himself as a CEO, but simply as a man making and selling a sauce he had invented. The family governance structures that have evolved over 5 generations to manage the complexity of a multi-generational family business continue to function, though the specific arrangements are not publicly detailed. Avery Island itself remains a working production facility, a tourist destination, a nature preserve, and a family home, all simultaneously, a combination that would be difficult to create deliberately, but that has evolved organically from the specific history of the place and the family that has inhabited it. The jungle gardens attract visitors from across the country. The tours of the Tabasco production facility bring hundreds of thousands of people to the island each year. The McIlhenny family members who live on the island maintain a relationship to the place that goes beyond ownership, to something closer to stewardship, the sense of being responsible for a landscape and a legacy that they did not create and that they will not ultimately own, but that they hold in trust for the generations that follow. This language of stewardship, of holding something in trust rather than owning it outright, is characteristic of how the McIlhenny family talks about both the island and the company. It reflects a specific relationship to time, not the quarterly thinking of public companies, not even the annual thinking of most businesses, but the multi-generational thinking that is only possible when the ownership of an institution extends across generations, and the people managing it are genuinely accountable to the past and the future, as well as the present. Edmund McIlhenny's pepper plants are still growing on Avery Island. Not the same plants. Pepper plants don't live for 150 years, but plants grown from seeds selected from plants grown from seeds selected from plants grown from the original capsicum frutescens that McIlhenny cultivated on the island after the Civil War. The genetic lineage is continuous. The place is the same. The process is recognizably descended from what McIlhenny developed in the late 1860s. That continuity is remarkable. In a business world characterized by constant disruption, where companies that were dominant a decade ago are irrelevant today, and where the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500 has declined to approximately 20 years, the McIlhenny Company has been doing essentially the same thing in essentially the same place for over 150 years. It has done so by getting a few fundamental things right and maintaining them with a consistency that has proven more valuable than any amount of innovation or disruption. The fundamental things are simple to state and difficult to sustain. Make something genuinely good. Price it honestly as what it is. Not cheap, because it isn't cheap to make well, but not at a price that makes it inaccessible to the people who would love it. Maintain the quality regardless of the temptation to cut costs. Build the brand on what is real, the actual island, the actual process, the actual history, rather than on claims that cannot be sustained. Keep the ownership in the family so that the time horizon of decision-making is genuinely long. And trust that if you do these things consistently, across enough time, the institution you build will outlast the inevitable crises that every business faces. Edmund McIlhenny proved this formula under the most difficult possible conditions. Not the comfortable conditions of a man with resources and options, but the desperate conditions of a man who had lost everything and had only a bottle and some pepper plants and the commercial intelligence he had spent a lifetime developing. From those materials, he built something that has lasted over a century and a half, that is known in 195 countries, that is still owned by his family, and that is still made on the same island where he first crushed those red peppers in the summer of 1868. That is not just a business success story. It is a demonstration of what human beings are capable of when they combine genuine craft, clear thinking, and the specific kind of stubbornness that refuses to accept that what has been destroyed cannot be rebuilt into something better than what it was before. The banker lost his bank. He found his pepper plants. And the world has been a little more interesting to eat in ever since. To understand what the McIlhenny Company has accomplished across 6 generations, it helps to understand how unusual that accomplishment is in the broader landscape of business history. Family businesses, as a category, tend to follow a predictable arc. The founder creates something through force of personality, specific expertise, and the particular energy that comes from having nothing to lose. The second generation inherits a going concern, and the founder's methods, often without fully inheriting the founder's understanding of why those methods worked. The third generation inherits wealth and a brand but may lack intimate familiarity with the craft that created them. By the 4th or 5th generation, the distance between the current leadership and the founding insight has become so great that the company either professionalizes, hiring outside management and effectively becoming a corporate entity that happens to have family shareholders, or it drifts, gradually losing the qualities that made it distinctive until it is eventually sold or simply fades. The McIlhenny Company has not followed this arc. Across 6 generations, it has remained privately held, family managed, and committed to the same production process on the same piece of land. This is not because the McIlhenny family has been immune to the pressures that fracture other family businesses. They have faced those pressures, the diverging interests of multiple branches of a family tree. The temptation to monetize a valuable brand through licensing arrangements that would compromise quality, the appeals of outside capital that comes with outside control. And they have navigated them. The specific mechanisms by which they have done so are not entirely public, but the results are visible in the product itself. A hot sauce that tastes today as it tasted decades ago, made by the same process, carrying the same distinctive shape. What the McIlhenny story suggests is that multi-generational success in a family business is not primarily a financial or organizational achievement. It is a cultural achievement. The family has maintained across 6 generations a shared understanding of what the company is for, what it is not for, and what would be lost if it compromised the things that make it what it is. That shared understanding is not written into a governance document, though governance documents exist and serve their purpose. It is transmitted through the specific experience of growing up on Avery Island, of understanding from childhood that the pepper plants growing in the fields outside are not merely agricultural products, but the living continuation of something your great-great-great-grandfather planted in the aftermath of catastrophe. That kind of inheritance is not transferable through a stock certificate. It is transmitted through place, through story, through the particular experience of being someone for whom the company's history is also personal history. Avery Island is not simply the location where Tabasco is made. It is the reason Tabasco is what it is, in a sense that goes beyond the obvious fact that the salt dome beneath the surface provides the white salt that goes into every bottle. The island, technically a salt dome rising above the Louisiana marshland, not an island in the conventional sense surrounded by open water, is a place of unusual ecological richness. The jungle gardens that Edmund McIlhenny's son, Edward Avery McIlhenny, developed in the early 20th century cover 170 acres of subtropical vegetation, including the bird city rookery that Edward established as a sanctuary for the snowy egret at a time when the species was being hunted nearly to extinction for its feathers. The island is home to alligators, herons, ibises, and dozens of other species that are found in its protected wetlands, a refuge from the development that has transformed so much of coastal Louisiana. This ecological dimension of the McIlhenny Company's identity is not incidental to its business identity. It reflects the same set of values: the commitment to preserving what is genuinely good, the willingness to invest in the long term rather than extract maximum value in the short term, the sense that ownership of something valuable carries with it the responsibility to pass that thing on in better condition than you received it. Edward McIlhenny did not establish the Bird City Rookery because it made business sense. He did it because he cared about snowy egrets, and because caring about snowy egrets was consistent with the same disposition that led his father to care about making hot sauce properly rather than cheaply. The values are of a piece. For visitors who come to Avery Island today, and hundreds of thousands make the journey each year, the experience of the place communicates something that no advertising campaign could replicate. You arrive at the island by crossing a small bridge, paying a modest toll, and entering what feels like a different world, densely vegetated, humid, alive with bird calls, smelling of earth and vegetation rather than industry. The production facility is there, and the tour is genuinely interesting. The pepper mash aging in white oak barrels, the workers hand-testing the color of each batch against a reference standard, the bottling line moving at a pace that seems almost leisurely by the standards of modern food manufacturing. But what stays with visitors is the totality of the place, the sense that they have encountered something that has been in continuous operation in this specific location for longer than living memory extends. That is maintained with an evident care that goes beyond what mere commercial interest would require, and that will in all probability still be here long after they are gone. That experience, the feeling of encountering something genuinely old and genuinely continuous, is itself a competitive advantage that cannot be manufactured. It can only be earned across time by the consistent choices of people who understood that they were building something larger than themselves. Edmund McIlhenny made those choices under duress, in the aftermath of losing everything. The generations that followed him made those choices with the benefit of an established institution and a functioning brand, which might seem easier, but carries its own temptations. The temptation to coast on what has been built, to cut corners in ways that accumulated slowly enough not to be visible in any single year, to make the 100 small compromises that, taken together, would eventually transform what was genuine into something merely adequate. The McIlhenny family, across 6 generations, has largely resisted those temptations. That resistance is the achievement. There is a recurring debate in the food industry about whether craft and scale are fundamentally compatible. The argument on the craft side goes like this: the qualities that make a food product genuinely good, the attention to individual ingredients, the patience required for proper aging or fermentation, the willingness to discard batches that don't meet standard rather than blending them into something passable, are qualities that become increasingly difficult to maintain as production volumes rise. Scale demands consistency, and consistency at scale is achieved through standardization, automation, and the substitution of process control for human judgment. The things you gain through scale, lower unit costs, wider distribution, greater availability, come at the expense of the things that made the product worth scaling in the first place. The argument on the other side goes like this: the craft argument romanticizes smallness, the things that genuinely matter about a food product, its flavor, its safety, its reliability, can be maintained at scale if the commitment to maintaining them is genuine. What kills quality in scaled production is not scale itself, but the decision to prioritize cost reduction over quality maintenance, a decision that small producers make as readily as large ones when financial pressure mounts. The question is not how large the production operation is, but whether the people running it actually care about what they are making. The McIlhenny Company is interesting evidence in this debate because it represents a case in which scale has been achieved, tens of millions of bottles annually, distribution in nearly 200 countries, without apparent sacrifice of the qualities that the original product was designed to achieve. The pepper mash still ages in white oak barrels for up to 3 years before it becomes hot sauce. The color of each batch is still compared to a physical reference standard rather than measured by an automated sensor. The same pepper variety, Capsicum frutescens, is still used, grown from seeds selected from the same genetic lineage that Edmund McIlhenny cultivated 150 years ago. These are not merely sentimental choices. They are choices that have direct consequences for the flavor and consistency of the product. The barrels matter because oak aging develops flavors that cannot be replicated by accelerated chemical processes. The color standard matters because color correlates with ripeness, and ripeness at harvest correlates with the concentration of the compounds that give Tabasco its distinctive heat and flavor profile. The pepper variety matters because Capsicum frutescens produces a specific set of capsaicinoids in a specific ratio that gives Tabasco its characteristic heat, a quick, clean burn that dissipates relatively rapidly rather than the lingering heat of some other varieties. These are not arbitrary commitments to tradition. They are commitments to the specific qualities that make the product what it is, maintained with the understanding that abandoning them would produce a different product, one that would be cheaper to make and less good to eat. The craft argument, at its best, is not really about scale. It is about attention, the sustained, careful attention to what makes something good, and the willingness to maintain that attention against the persistent pressure to trade quality for convenience. The McIlhenny Company has sustained that attention across 6 generations and across a roughly 10,000-fold increase in production volume. That is the achievement that the craft argument demands to see demonstrated, and Tabasco is one of the clearest demonstrations that it can be done. When marketing academics and practitioners discuss brand equity, the premium that consumers are willing to pay for a named product over a generic equivalent, they typically focus on awareness, associations, and loyalty as the drivers of that equity. Consumers pay more for branded products because they are aware of the brand, because they associate the brand with positive qualities, and because past experience has built loyalty that reduces the perceived risk of purchasing. This framework is accurate as far as it goes, but it tends to treat brand equity as something constructed through communication, through advertising, packaging, endorsement, and the other tools of the marketing apparatus. The Tabasco case suggests a different and in some ways more fundamental source of brand equity, the consistency of the product over time. Tabasco has not been heavily advertised relative to its market position. It has not relied on celebrity endorsements or elaborate brand campaigns. It has not changed its packaging or its formula in response to trend cycles that move through the food industry with predictable regularity. What it has done is make the same product to the same standard year after year, decade after decade, in a way that allows consumers to know with genuine certainty what they are getting when they reach for the distinctive bottle. This certainty is rarer than it sounds. The food industry is characterized by a persistent pattern in which brands that are acquired or that face significant financial pressure quietly reformulate their products, substituting less expensive ingredients, reducing aging times, adjusting flavor profiles to reduce production costs, while maintaining the same branding and the same price point. Consumers often sense these changes without being able to articulate them precisely. They notice that a product they liked no longer tastes the same, but because the change has been gradual, and because the company's messaging continues to emphasize heritage and tradition, they may not immediately identify reformulation as the cause. Over time, this pattern erodes the brand equity that was built through decades of consistent quality. The McIlhenny Company has not followed this pattern. The consistency of the product is not merely claimed through marketing. It is verifiable by any consumer who has been buying Tabasco for 20 or 30 years and who has developed a calibrated sense of what it tastes like. That verifiability is the foundation of a kind of trust that advertising cannot buy. It can only be earned one bottle at a time, across time horizons that exceed the tenure of any individual manager or the attention span of any annual business plan. Edmund McIlhenny understood this intuitively, which is why he chose premium pricing and the cologne bottle and the distinctive label from the beginning. He was not trying to create awareness or generate trial. He was trying to establish a promise that what was inside the bottle would be worth what the bottle cost, and that the promise would be kept. The generations that followed him have kept it. The brand equity that has accumulated across 150 years of kept promises is now the company's most valuable asset, more valuable than the production facility, more valuable than the brand name its meaning. The contemporary business environment is in many respects the antithesis of what the McIlhenny Company represents. The companies that attract the most attention, the most capital, and the most press coverage are companies that grow fast, disrupt existing industries, and pursue scale with an urgency that treats deliberation as a competitive disadvantage. The celebrated startup founder is someone who moves quickly, breaks things, and iterates rapidly, rather than aging product in oak barrels and selecting seeds with generational patience. The celebrated investor is someone who identifies opportunities before others and exits before the inevitable correction, rather than holding an ownership stake across multiple generations. There is nothing inherently wrong with this orientation, and the companies it produces have created genuine value, but it operates on a set of assumptions that speed is inherently virtuous, that disruption is inherently progressive, that the old ways of doing things are old because they are inferior, that the McIlhenny story challenges in ways that are worth taking seriously. Speed is not inherently virtuous. There are things, flavor development, institutional trust, brand equity, the cultivation of craft skills, that cannot be accelerated without being fundamentally changed. An oak barrel needs time to do what it does to pepper mash, and there is no technological substitute for that time that produces the same result. An institution needs time to build a reputation for consistency, and there is no marketing campaign that can substitute for decades of actually being consistent. A craft skill needs time to develop, and there is no training program that produces in weeks what apprenticeship produces across years. The assumption that speed is always a competitive advantage is an assumption that applies within a specific domain of business activity, the domain where the relevant qualities can be produced quickly, and does not generalize to the domain where the relevant qualities are, by their nature, the product of time. Disruption is not inherently progressive. The food industry has been disrupted repeatedly over the past several decades, most recently by the proliferation of artisanal and small-batch food products that have challenged the dominance of large consumer food companies. Some of this disruption has produced genuinely better products. Some of it has produced products that are priced as better without being so, trading on aesthetic signals of craft, the hand-lettered label, the amber glass jar, the narrative of the passionate founder, without the underlying commitment to quality that those signals are supposed to represent. The disruption has been real. The improvement has been uneven. Tabasco, meanwhile, has continued to be what it was, largely unmoved by the cycles of trend and counter-trend that have remade the hot sauce market around it. The old ways of doing things are not always old because they are inferior. Sometimes they are old because they work. The 3-year aging process for Tabasco pepper mash works because it produces a flavor that shorter aging does not produce. The white oak barrel works because it contributes specific compounds to the flavor that other containers do not contribute. The capsicum fruit sense pepper variety works because its capsaicinoid profile produces the specific heat experience that Tabasco is designed to deliver. These are not old ways that have survived through inertia or nostalgia. They are old ways that have survived through the ongoing verification that they produce a better result than the alternatives. A verification that occurs every time someone opens a bottle of Tabasco and experiences what more than a century of careful production has made possible. The lesson for the contemporary business world is not that speed and disruption and innovation are bad. It is that they are not universally good. That there are domains of human activity where the virtues that produce excellence are patience, consistency, and the refusal to sacrifice quality for convenience, and that those domains deserve to be recognized and respected as such. The McIlhenny Company is a 150-year demonstration of what those virtues can produce, In a world that has largely forgotten how to practice them, that demonstration is more valuable than it might at first appear. The most important thing Edmund McIlhenny left behind was not a recipe, though the recipe matters. It was not a brand, though the brand has proven extraordinarily durable. It was not a production process, though the process is the foundation of everything else. The most important thing Edmund McIlhenny left behind was a set of values, a way of understanding what a business is for and how a product should be made. That has been transmitted across 6 generations with sufficient clarity and force that it continues to shape decisions made today, 150 years after he first crushed those red peppers on Avery Island. Those values can be stated simply: make something genuinely good, be honest about what it is, keep the quality consistent, and take the long view. They are not exotic values. They are, in some sense, the values that any craftsperson who takes pride in their work would recognize immediately. What is unusual about the McIlhenny story is not the values themselves, but the institutional structure, the family ownership, the commitment to the island, the multi-generational patience that has allowed those values to be maintained against the persistent pressure of the forces that erode them. Edmund McIlhenny did not design that institutional structure. He did not sit down in 1868 with a governance document and a succession plan and a family charter. He made hot sauce because he had pepper plants and needed money. And he made it well because he was the kind of person who made things well. And he priced it as a premium product because his banking background told him that the difference between premium and ordinary is largely a matter of commitment and presentation. The institutional structure that has sustained those choices across 6 generations evolved from the specific circumstances of the McIlhenny family, their relationship to Avery Island, their sense of themselves as stewards of something larger than any individual's career, their understanding that the company's value is inseparable from the specific place and process that created it. That understanding, that value is inseparable from the specific conditions that produce it, is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Tabasco story. It is a lesson that runs counter to many of the assumptions of contemporary business, which tends to treat brand equity as separable from the operations that created it, hence the prevalence of licensing and brand extension strategies that leverage a brand name across product categories that have nothing to do with the original product, and which tends to treat operational excellence as replicable and transferable, rather than as the hard-won product of specific circumstances, specific skills, and specific commitments maintained over long periods of time. The McIlhenny Company has understood, in a practical rather than theoretical way, that what makes Tabasco valuable is not separable from how it is made, where it is made, and who makes it. That understanding is what has kept the company from the licensing deals and brand extensions that have diluted other food brands. It is what has kept the production on Avery Island rather than moving it to a more convenient or less expensive location. It is what has kept the same process in place despite the availability of cheaper and faster alternatives. And it is ultimately what has kept the product genuinely good across 150 years of inevitable pressure to make it merely adequate. Edmund McIlhenny was a banker who became a hot sauce maker because circumstances gave him no better option. He turned out to be extraordinarily good at both the making and the selling, and he left behind an institution that has proven far more durable than the bank he lost in the Civil War. The institution has survived because the family that inherited it understood, in each generation, that what they were inheriting was not merely a business, but a set of commitments to a place, to a process, to a standard of quality that constituted the business's identity and its value. To inherit the business without inheriting the commitments would be to inherit a brand name and a production facility, and none of what made them worth anything. 6 generations of McIlhennys have understood this. That understanding is the real legacy. More important than the recipe, more important than the bottle, more important than the brand. It is the understanding that what you make and how you make it that way are not separable things. They are one thing. And if you keep them one thing, across enough time, what you have built will outlast everything else. The pepper plants are still growing on Avery Island. The barrels are still aging in the warehouse. The bottles are still moving down the line, capped and labeled and packed, carrying inside them a flavor that Edmund McIlhenny first produced in the summer of 1868, when a banker with nothing left to lose decided to see what he could do with what he had. It turned out he could do quite a lot. So we have traced the full arc. From the collapse of Edmund McIlhenny's banking career in the ruins of post-Civil War New Orleans, through the experimental summer on Avery Island that produced the first 350 bottles, through the building of a brand that would reach 195 countries, through 5 generations of family stewardship, to the company that still operates today on the same island where it began. The Tabasco story resists easy categorization. It is not a story of technological innovation. The recipe is essentially what it was in 1868. It is not a story of visionary market disruption. McIlhenny did not see a gap in the market and fill it deliberately. It is not even, in the conventional sense, a startup story. There was no venture capital, no growth hacking, no scaling strategy borrowed from Silicon Valley. It is a story about craft, patience, and the specific advantages that a genuinely good product, honestly made and honestly priced, accumulates over time when the people responsible for it resist the temptations that destroy most businesses. The temptation to cut quality for margin, to sell to a bigger company for a short-term payout, to grow faster than the quality of the product can sustain. The modern relevance is not primarily about hot sauce. It is about what it means to build something that lasts. Not something that grows explosively for a decade and then collapses. Not something that is acquired by a corporation and absorbed into a portfolio of brands, but something that is still doing what it was designed to do in the way it was designed to do it, a century and a half after its founding. Very few businesses achieve this. The ones that do tend to share certain characteristics, a genuine product quality that creates real customer loyalty rather than manufactured brand attachment, a family or closely held ownership structure that enables genuinely long-term thinking, a specific place or provenance that anchors the brand's identity in something that cannot be easily replicated, and a cultural transmission mechanism that passes the values and the practices that made the business successful from one generation to the next without losing the essential character of what was built. The McIlhenny Company has all of these. It had them because Edmund McIlhenny, a bankrupt banker with a cologne bottle and some pepper plants, made a series of good decisions in the late 1860s and early 1870s that established the character of the institution before he had any way of knowing what institution he was building. That is how legacies work. You do not build them by planning legacies. You build them by making good decisions, consistently over time, in the service of something you believe is genuinely worth making. The legacy is what accumulates around those decisions, invisibly, until the day someone looks back and discovers that what seemed like a simple thing, a small bottle of hot sauce from a Louisiana island, has become something that touches the lives of people in 195 countries. Edmund McIlhenny could not have imagined any of that in 1868. He was just trying to rebuild his life, and he did. And the peppers are still growing. If this one stayed with you, if there was a moment in Edmund McIlhenny's story that made you think differently about resilience, or about what it means to build something that lasts, drop a in the comments. I want to know who followed the full story from that cologne bottle to 195 countries. The McIlhenny Company is one of those businesses that rewards close attention. The more you look at it, the production process, the family governance, the brand positioning, the specific decisions that each generation made, the more interesting it becomes. This script represents the accessible surface of a much deeper story. If you want to go further, the McIlhenny Company has published a book called The McIlhenny Company 150 Years of Tabasco that goes into the family history in considerably more detail than I could cover here. If you found this depth useful, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you see the next one. For the natural follow-up, our episode on the Worcestershire sauce story, the British condiment that was accidentally invented in the 1830s by a chemist named John Wheely Lear and a merchant named William Henry Perrins, who left a barrel of failed sauce in their cellar for 2 years and discovered on reopening it that something extraordinary had happened, runs parallel to the Tabasco story in fascinating ways. 2 accidental fermentations, 2 family businesses, 2 condiments that shaped the flavor of the Western table for nearly 2 centuries. The Lear and Perrins story is, if anything, even stranger than the McIlhenny one. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching something that takes the full complexity of a simple bottle seriously. See you in the next one.